Welcome to Selling Secrets, the show about action movies and spy films. Our mission is to look at the movies we love and go behind the scenes of what makes a successful action film. Each week, we'll take a deep dive into the filmmaking process, the marketing of Hollywood, and more. Do you know what it takes to make a Hollywood blockbuster successful? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Today's episode is a very special one, where I'm interviewing Tony Gay, aka my father. In the interview, we talk about Tony's time in the Royal Australian Navy, as well as his time in the Special Air Service, and his work as a videographer, editor, and photographer. I want to thank Tony for coming on. It was an absolute privilege to talk to him and hear about his story, and I hope you genuinely enjoyed this conversation that we had. So without further ado, here is my interview with Tony Gay. Joining me today is my dad, Tony Gay. Tony, thank you very much for coming on.
Josh, thanks for having me. I'm actually quite flattered to think that my son would want me to tell my story, that it's a story worth listening to. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, look, I can always have you on. You're my dad, so it makes life easy to be able to ask you to come on. But really wanted to get you on because I definitely think you've got a fascinating story that lends itself to sort of what I've been discussing on the podcast. So can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, who you are, what you do for a living?
So I grew up in Victoria and I joined the Navy when I was about 18. It was one of those things, rather running to something. I think I was running away from a number of things. It was just family circumstances at the time. I'd had visions of joining the Navy, but not as a seaman. I ended up just joining as a general, not a general recruit, but as a recruit rather than with a commission, and joined as a sonar operator. So went through basic recruit training, seamanship school, and then up to HMAS Watson in New South Wales on South Head there, and studied how to become a sonar operator. So that thing of listening to the pings and the blips and looking at screens and looking for submarines and ships and the like, which was absolutely fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed that. But the reality of it is, on surface ships, certainly at that time, it was incredibly boring. It was certainly life as a sonar operator on a submarine is quite different. But for myself, being sort of about 190 centimeters, life's challenging on a submarine. Certainly the class of submarine, the O-boats, the Oberon class that were around at the time. So I opted for the surface ships. And I think because of the lack of challenge once I was actually on the surface ships, my initial thought on joining the Navy was, I'd like to be a diver or a photographer. I had an interest in both. Absolutely loved being around the water, sailing, rowing, life-saving, all sorts of things like that. But when I joined up, they said that, no, you can't join up as either of those. You've got to change over once you're in. So once I'd spent a bit of time in the Navy, I did what was called a ship's divers course. So I can't remember if it was a 2-week or a 1-month course, but it was a number of weeks, and it was absolutely awesome. The opportunity to really get quite fit, sort of maintain fitness and do all the diving, the night diving, deep diving. It wasn't the clearance divers course, but it certainly piqued my interest towards being a clearance diver. And at the same time as doing that, I followed on. It's just one of those things, you put up your hand and volunteer to do things, and the more you volunteer, the more cool things you get to do. So being a ship's diver was definitely a cool thing on board the ship, and my interest in photography grew while I was on the ship, and I sort of became the ship's photographer. So I had these two things happening together, and I was very fortunate that I got offered courses for both of them. I got offered to the clearance divers course and also the photography course, and At the time, the photography seemed to be the way to go. So I moved into working as a photographer. That at the time, photographers in the Defence Force were trained by the Air Force at RAF Base East Sale in Victoria. And it's essentially nearly a year-long course and the equivalent of a 3-year degree course. The detail and the depth of knowledge that you get exposed to there is just amazing. And one of the reasons for that is that in a lot of cases, working as a photographer in the Defence Force, you'd be independent. You'd be on your own. You'd be having to be able to be resourceful and independent and be able to, at the time, working with chemistry, be able to do all those things without being able to sort of go to a shop and ask for assistance, as it were.
That's phenomenal. So I want to touch on the photography side of things, because I know that's what you do for a living. Now you're a photographer, you're a videographer and editor, but back in the day, well, now at least, sorry, before we go back to back in the day, now in the Navy, that's not really a thing, the photographers. They don't really have them as much. They're more outsourced, is what I understand.
Well, it has changed. Yeah. You're quite right. The demand for photographers, certainly in the Air Force, it used to be enormous in the Air Force because their photographers were involved in the processing of all the imagery from the aircraft. So all of the F111s and other aircraft that were doing aerial surveillance and reconnaissance with their high-speed film cameras. The photographers were responsible for processing all that. Plus, with aircraft, any accidents, any breakdowns or things that go wrong with any of the aircraft, likewise with Army and Navy, everything had to be fully documented, which is the case with commercial aircraft as well. Everything has to be fully documented, what's gone wrong. So photographers were actively involved in that. The move to digital certainly changed that for the Air Force, because all of the sensors, instead of being film-based, became digital. So the material went straight from aircraft to imagery analysts rather than going through the hands of the photographers. So that the Air Force went from a couple of hundred photographers down to sort of about 25 or 30 photographers quite quickly. It was incredible. And the Navy numbers were only ever around the sort of 30 or 40 photographers. It was a very small group. And their numbers ended up, they're about 20 now, and they're trained externally rather than internally, and they're imagery specialists now. So that they do video, they do photography, and they are also involved in the collection and analysis of reconnaissance photography and the like, so that they're able to provide, when they're on board a ship, analysis of imagery, be it satellite, aircraft, or from handheld, analysis of that imagery for command.
Fantastic. So it's not just portraiture and promotional stuff. It's quite a varied job by the sound of things.
A photographer in the Defence Force, you're right, has an incredibly varied job. They have to be capable of doing intelligence. They have to be able to work in as I was describing, with the aircraft, doing defect photography. So very accurate, very millimeter precise photography, macro photography. They have to be able to do photography, medical photography, through to public relations, photojournalism. I think the photographers are being used much more now as photojournalists, being able to write stories. They're sort of learning how to do that as a photojournalist actually would, which is something that wasn't really, that was a different role. Someone else would write the story and the photographer would take the photo. So quite a wide variety of skills, which is absolutely fantastic. And included into that is video production for training, safety, a wide variety, and of course public relations video for release to the media and the like.
Very nice. So how long did you spend being a diver before you decided you'd make the move over to the photography side of things?
I joined the Defence Force of the Navy in 1982, and it was in 1985 that I was fortunate enough to get on the photographic course. They only ran one per year, and spots on that were always very limited for the Navy. There was only ever sort of 3 or 4. I think my course, we had the most. I think there was about 6 of us on that course. So it was, it was a great thing to do, and certainly the rest of my career through until I got out of the Navy in '99 was spent working as a photographer in a number.
So I understand as a photographer, it also allowed you the opportunity to travel quite a bit. You went to Japan as well as a number of other places, correct?
That's right. The Defence Force in general, especially the Navy, allows you to do a lot of travel. It's sounding like an ad for the Navy. Oh my God, it is not. Think twice before joining the Defence Force. The trip to Japan for me and through Southeast Asia was actually before becoming a photographer. But photographers in the Navy certainly tend to be land-based and join a ship purely for a deployment, whether it's as a task force deploying or an individual ship traveling somewhere. They'll take a photographer with them. So the opportunity to travel and quite extensively working as a photographer is very real. Working as a photographer, I sort of got to go all the way around Australia in both directions, by sea and by land, and travel to very remote places, from sort of deserted islands to very remote Aboriginal communities. And it was certainly a very special time. It was a real privilege being able to go to some of the places we went.
Absolutely, definitely. And that you did get to go to whilst you were serving in the Navy?
So for me, after finishing my study, I went to the Navy Photographic Unit at Garden Island in Sydney, which is sort of the heart of the Navy, really. That's where all the ships are based. And it was actually the Navy's 75th anniversary. So there were ships coming from all around the world, coming to Sydney Harbour to help celebrate the occasion of the Australian Navy's 75th anniversary. And it was a very big event. And photographically, it was enormous. The demands were incredible. So it was when I really first got to start hanging out the side of helicopters, photographing ships coming in and out of the harbour. I remember photographing the USS Missouri as she was in Sydney Harbour with the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House behind her. And I was like, it was a real special time. And going into Indigenous communities, and again, that was the first time I'd done that. That was during the 75th anniversary. One of the things that was happening was the Navy was sending the band and people to visit communities that had at some stage contributed to the Navy or had some influence from the Navy. People had come from those communities. So getting to go into a place on the Gove Peninsula called Nullumbi up in the Northern Territory, very remote. It's the sort of place that not many people ever get to go to. So it was very special getting to go there. Essentially, as a photographer, I've been to in and out of every capital city and most of the regional areas. And then after finishing, it was whilst I was on my basic course at SAL. I was when I first learnt about the Navy having a detachment with the Special Air Service in Western Australia. At that stage, there was a counter-terrorist unit called the Tactical Assault Group, and the Navy's clearance divers were attached to the Special Air Service, and there was a photographer as a part of that commitment. And I heard about that, and having been working as a ship's diver and loving being really fit and loving all the challenge, like, well, there's another challenge. And once I got up to working in Sydney, I put up my hand and said, look, when that next comes up, I'd love the opportunity. And I was incredibly fortunate. I was given the opportunity to then, after leaving Sydney, move across to Western Australia and work with the Special Air Service for 3 years in the counter-terrorist role. So in that role, we were on 2 hours notice to travel anywhere. It was, I likened it at the time to what you'd see in the movies. It was what we were doing was what people thought only happened in movies. I think now people accept much more that that is what happens. But at the time, everything from fast roping out of a helicopter was, at the time, that was classified. No one was allowed to know about that being a way of doing things, because it meant people wouldn't expect that you could be inserted into a target at such high speed. They're expecting that helicopters would have to land or you'd be repelling. But no, this whole idea of fast roping at that stage was incredibly new, and that was considered secret. So it was very early days of the counter-terrorism and the black suits and sort of military playing in a real active role in counter-terrorism. It's not just being police or intelligence services, it's having a dedicated military force that could respond to those events. And it's really developed significantly from that time.
And that was around the period with at least the British SAS, the Iranian embassy siege, roughly. That was sort of when they were becoming more known, as you said, the black suits.
Absolutely.
Can you talk to your time in the SAS a little bit more? Because from what you've told me throughout, my childhood growing up, it's always been very exciting listening to the war stories, as I call them. But it's so cool.
It really was the highlight of my career. So out of all the time I had in the Defence Force, that's the time that really, I think, impacted me the most, because it was, in inverted commas, it was real. It was, you were 2 hours notice. It was, the shooters were putting hundreds of rounds downrange every day. The people I was working with there, I think when I arrived, what really struck me was how intelligent, how smart and independent just your average trooper at the regiment is. They're incredibly well educated typically, and they're looking for a challenge. And they're very balanced people. Quite often you'll see within military, you'll have people who are a little bit on the extremes, and you don't get that at the regiment. All of those people are really weeded out, and they never make it there. You don't want someone who's a little bit extreme or who's a little bit jittery. They're all very, very balanced. I mean, from a prime example is how concerned they are about their health and their performance. So many vegetarians and vegans. It was one of the first exposures I'd had. My mum was vegetarian, but beyond my mum, who was I always saw, you think, she's your mum, she's a vegetarian. Wow, no one else in the world is. But here I am working with these guys who is the antithesis, really, of just the average sailor that I've been working with. It was an elite athlete level of fitness was considered the base, really, of everyone that worked there. Everyone had to be able to, what are we doing today for PT? We're going for a half marathon. We're going. And off you'd go. Wasn't something you had to work up to. That was something you had to, that's what we're doing today. That's what you go, and that's what you do. So from that sense, I think a lot of what you hear is very, very real, but at the same time distorted. I mean, governments, I didn't appreciate it at the time so much, but governments really want special operations and elite forces in both police and military. That's something they want because it makes them sound good. Our elite forces are the best or some of the best in the world, be it police or military. And understandably, they're proud of that. And as is the average person on the street. Oh, yeah, at the SAS, I mean, wow. And so having that absolute elite force is a good thing for the military, something for them to work to. But I think what they don't want, and what we've seen a bit of recently, is what they don't want is what comes with training people to those extremes. And one of the things that really hit me while I was working there was how intense it was, the levels that we were working at, and then not being able to get debriefed when you were leaving.
Well, and that's the thing. So the SAS, they're being trained as killers. That's the whole idea. They're not They're not average seamen. They're not, riding in a tank. They're not mechanics. Your job in the SAS, be it as a sniper or as a gunner or whatever you're doing, you are being trained to kill. And recently, as we've saw in the news media, at least, is the SAS and the second squadron have been embroiled in some scandals. And something that I've had discussions with you in the past is they're getting these trained killers who are working day in, day out on shooting ranges, doing live fire exercises. They're then sending them on patrols basically to be peacekeepers almost. They're going into villages.
Public relations.
Yeah. So
it's at the time I was working with the regiment, there wasn't that. It was very much under wraps, undercover. We weren't paraded around. It wasn't sending the Special Air Service Regiment off to wave the flag or anything like that. It was always on the down low. It was always very quiet. Whenever we traveled anywhere, it was always in overalls or civilian clothing. It was very quiet. There was never a fanfare made about it, and which was a good thing. There was a shift in policy where the government, wanting people to know about their special operations people in a sense, or wanting to show that we're taking this seriously, started sending the elite units to do peacekeeping missions, to do
grunt work,
flag waving, public relations, where you're really wanting your average platoon from your average regiment to go there rather than from the Special Air Service Regiment. I think that's where we started to see some things fall down. That these guys, as you were saying, who are trained to do behind enemy lines operations, covert operations, were being expected to do, just everyday duty. It gets, the whole politics of it, unfortunately, comes into it. And so the guys, whilst they're trained in their field roles to shoot and to be able to kill, it's more run away. Which, as odd as it sounds, that they don't want to get caught. They don't want to be in for firefights.
Because you don't have backup, right? It's a small platoon.
They're behind enemy lines, and that is the role of those special operators. And from a counter-terrorism point of view, that's quite different in that is very overt. That's, you're on the ground and you're going in and you are shooting at whoever's got a gun and whoever's moving. So that's very different to the behind enemy lines. So that's assaulting a target with maximum speed, maximum force and aggression to neutralize it and save the lives of the hostages. A very different role, and it required a lot of different training for the multiple roles that the regiment has.
As Chris Ryan or Andy McNabb said, violence is what the SAS are very strong at doing, going in, as you said, going in hard, going in fast, and being so violent that they shock the terrorists that you're attacking basically into submission. Very, very crazy. I mean, it's stuff that you only hear about in movies, as you said.
Well, it is. And I think that's one of the things that movies do miss out on, is that training. These guys to be working at that level of accuracy from shooting. I mean, the accuracy, everyone that goes there, politicians, wives, I remember a wives' day where all the wives got to go along and see what the husbands did, or their partners. And so they got to go along and play with the H&Ks. They got to go into an aircraft mock-up, and they had someone walk into the front of the aircraft, one of the guys, and he said, okay, ladies, everyone sit down. I want you to take your seats. So don't want anyone to put their hand up. I'm going to just talk you through a bit about what the guys do. So whilst the ladies are sitting down, two operators come in at the back, fully kitted out in all their gear, and either side of the guy who's talking to the ladies at the front starts coming up pictures. And within a foot or two either side of him, bullets start landing and taking out targets. So there's targets coming up, and so there's bullets going inches above the ladies' heads while they're sitting there watching this and getting to understand it. So the confidence that everyone has to have in their in the people that they're working is extraordinary, because they are live rounds that are going down. So if working in the killing house and you're standing there as a hostage next to a target that is a terrorist, you're going to have live rounds going next to you. And part of that is to understand and build up a trust with the people you're working with, because there's these live rounds. Now, to achieve that level of accuracy and that confidence in the people you're working with isn't I'll go down the range once every now and then. The guys are spending hours on the range daily, going through that, working on their fitness, going through working, how do they assault a building? How do they assault an aircraft? It's continuous, high level, high intensity training, which sees injuries physically and mentally. The stuff that the guys have to get put through to work at that level is extraordinary, which is why to even get to be there and training to do that before you get there, obviously you've got to go through those selection courses, the Carter course, and that weeds out a lot of people. So I think what movies quite often miss is that is a continuous process. They almost show that these guys go out there and do it, and that they've been dropping a few beers just before they went out, where the reality is they've been working damn hard on all aspects of their life to be able to go and do that.
Or the training's a montage. That's a 30-second clip. You don't want to see what goes into Rocky's fight. You want to see the fight.
And certainly from like your spy movies, be it Bond or your Bournes, ones like that, where it's a single operator and they're an incredibly accurate shot. And the reality is, to be shooting at that level of accuracy consistently, they've got to be on the range consistently to be able to fight the way they do. They've got to be training damn hard every day in hand-to-hand combat, in training with knife fighting, training with all those up close techniques, which, well, you never see that in the movies. You never see all that backstory that allows them to do that, because you get the guys miss out on doing that for a while, and that they've lost touch with they've lost that edge, and that working at that level is what gives them the edge that's going to make them better than everyone else they come across.
You almost see that in the Bond film Skyfall, when he comes back from, semi-retirement and he can't shoot the targets at the same level. You get that sort of, you've been out of the game for a bit, and it only takes a short period of time to lose that fitness and lose that edge. Working, if you don't mind me touching on it, working at such a high level for such extended periods of times, you've spoken about it very briefly. It must take a toll on you mentally. And coming out of the Special Air Service, what is that like for someone? Obviously you went back into the Navy as a photographer. What's that like, and what's the effect that it has on someone? Obviously everyone's different, but to have been working at such a high level, can you speak to that in a way? Because it is a really unfortunate thing that while I was there, a lot of guys I knew, when they left the regiment, didn't want to go back to regular army. And they'd had enough of being at the regiment, just working at that intensity. It's hard on families, hard on individuals. Injuries take a toll. And so it's like, well, I'm going to move on. And for a lot of them, what do? You're a trained killer. What skills do you have? You can jump out of aircraft, jump out of helicopters. You can shoot targets on a close quarters range. You can assault buildings. You're very fit. Security forces, security sitting on a gate. A lot of guys join the police special operations groups in different states, work in training roles. You get the guys that do go and join as a private contractor in different organizations. It's a really challenging transition for people. There's no doubt about that. For myself, after 3 years there, I was given the opportunity. I was actually approached if I wanted to work with a couple of different organizations, and it's like, well, no, I think I want to stay, rather than staying in an intelligence area,
I'd like to move back into a creative role. For me, that's where I think my passion was. So I sort of opted not to pursue work in an intelligence arena, and walking back into the Navy life and the Navy photographic unit, which is where I was before I went across to the regiment, I literally burst into tears. It was heartbreaking. It's like, oh my God, what am I doing back here? This going from something that is so real that you feel is such a needed role, where it was real. This is serious. This is important. What we're doing really matters. To go back to the Navy and it being just, just life again. You go home at the end of the day. There's none of this being on 2 hours notice, being away from home more than you spend more time away than you do at home. It was a very different mentality. And it was, for me, it was heartbreaking. It's like, oh my God, why did I leave that? That was horrendous. I think I was fortunate that I was able to take that energy that I'd really grown to love while I was at the regiment and try and bring some of that to the role that I was at in Sydney. And we really built up a high level of sort of public relations photography, sort of doing projects and sort of trying to lift it up to another level, the work that we were doing. So I didn't want to just drop back and do nothing. But it's, having said that, it wasn't just the regiment that experienced that. A lot of photographers, when they got out, one thing that you never learned as a photographer was how to in the Defence Force was how to network, how to run a business, how to work with clients, things like that. There's clients to a certain extent, but people came to you for the work because you were there. So a lot of people would get out of the Defence Force and say, right, I'm going to go into business for myself as a photographer, and not have a clue what to do and how to do it. And it was scary. And seeing all these people do that really put me off going to work for myself once I left the Defence Force. And so I became very much aware that, okay, I have to build up a set of skills that sees me employable, because the guys at the regiment weren't necessarily employable. A lot of photographers trying to run their own businesses, well, that didn't necessarily work. So you had to have something that you could offer an employer. And so I continued to push myself hard, and I got into a video production role. And really, this was when there was tape-based machines. You're sort of doing AB roll on tapes and ABC rolls, and so multi-decks and juggling tapes, and you make a mistake. And the difference is, like, working with tape-based systems is like working with a typewriter. If you make a mistake, you take the page out and you go back and you start again. Whereas working with the non-linear systems is much more like a word processor with video production. So I was fortunate that I'd moved into a video role and was able to move across into a non-linear role. The Navy was able to see the value in going into non-linear. The camera equipment in the 90s, video camera equipment was the cost of a house, and non-linear editing systems were the same. It was all new technology, computers, and all of the gear that went towards being able to digitize computer equipment, the video signals, was incredibly expensive because it was all very new. It was all very cutting edge. So being in a position where I could immerse myself in it and learn about those new systems before a lot of other people were able to, because the Defence Force could see, the Navy could see the benefit in having that. It increased my productivity dramatically. I thought I'd be, 20, 30% more productive, maybe 50% more productive. I went to sort of 200-300% more productive being able to be non-linear rather than being tape-based. The difference was enormous, and the quality of production increased.
We take that for granted now, don't we?
We do. We do.
I mean, we can do all of that, as you're calling it, non-linear. Everyone goes, "Oh, it's just video editing. I can do it on my phone now." Well, it's phenomenal.
The average
isn't it?
phone now has more storage within the phone than what my first edit suite had. I had 32
That cost more than a house.
That cost more than a house. Yeah, it was incredible. And I was very fortunate because I was in that area and just at the stage of my career I was at. I was asked if I wanted to go to the Air Force School of Photography and be one of the instructors there, because I had this experience and with the nonlinear systems, and I'd worked with a lot of the Air Force guys as well. I was fortunate that I was in a position where I interacted a lot with people from other services. Working as a photographer, I got to know a lot of people from other bases, Air Force photographers, and somehow word trickled through that I had my pulse on the whole digital side. And this is at a time when everyone was still shooting film and looking at, okay, how are we going to go digital? And so I was taken on at the School of Photography in a role teaching people about digital imaging and also video production, which was fantastic. It was exciting. It was all very new and very challenging. And most of the time I was bugger being a page ahead of the students. I was on the same page as the students. We were trying to figure it all out between us because it was changing so quickly. And the course itself, the content was all very new. Some very smart guys had sat down, tried to work out, well, what's the curriculum? What are the basics? But the actual, what is it we're going to teach and how we're going to teach it? I pity the guys on that first course. I really do. Just amazing. Actually, one of the guys on the first course replaced me at the regiment. He was amazing, so full on. He's now works in a very high level within defence intelligence. He loved the intelligence side of it and very passionate about it. So where I went back to a creative side, he said, I'm going full on in the intelligence side, and it works at an incredibly high level within intelligence now, and very, very successful. You'll notice I don't say his name.
Well, I wonder why, right?
The guy who was at the regiment before me ended up working with ASIO, and it's one of those things you've got to respect, that you don't talk about who they are, because, well, they're actually in that world still, and people don't need to know those names and what it is they're doing. And I think there's another difference with reality versus Bond, James Bond, is that, well, no, no, you don't talk about who those people are, because they're actually on the firing line. They're there, and they're potential targets for other intelligence operatives or for potential terrorists and organizations and their families. So having their names out there is something that you don't want. And that was like when we're at the regiment, it wasn't spoken about. You didn't tell people what role you had. You didn't talk about what you did. You were just, well, yeah, I'm Navy photographer.
That's why you don't see.
You don't say that you're counter-terrorism, the Special Air Service or anything like that. None of the guys there did. It was downplayed. There was no parading around. And your average guy at the regiment looked average.
Yeah, humble guys, right?
This whole idea of incredibly big, broad shoulders, huge, hulking guys. No, that's the exception. I look at Ben Roberts. I mean, my God, this guy's a mountain. He's huge. And he's sort of the exception to the rule. Most guys, they may not be the fastest, but they'll run all day with a pack on and they won't stop. So they've got this, it's not just physical, it's also mental. Well, it's not going to stop me. I'm just going to keep going.
Well, yeah, someone like, for instance, The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, he's all anaerobic fitness, right? He'll be in the gym and he'll be able to lift the heavy stuff, but put a pack on him and tell him to go and do a fast march. Good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't stop. You've got to keep going. Okay, stop. You have a drink or you're patrolling and you just keep going and going and going. And the ability to keep working. I mean, staying awake for a couple of days is something people go, oh, yeah, I went without sleep. But to actually keep working for a couple of days
at a high level,
sleep at a high level, and just keep going without sleep and actually working for day after day after day is something that's what's trained for, to be able to do that. You're actually regularly tested. Okay, just to understand yourself, just how far you can go. It's about seeing, well, how far can I push myself? Can I work for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days without sleep? How does that impact me? Recognizing what that does to your body, your decision-making process. So the guys are regularly being exposed to exercises where they're sleep deprived.
So I'm going to circle back a little bit. So
Yeah,
this will probably be the last bit of the conversation we have talking about the military side of things. What does a photographer do in the SAS? Obviously, you've spoken about your time in the Navy and you've touched on sort of the reconnaissance side of things, but how does a Navy guy, I can understand the divers and all of that, but how does a Navy photographer end up working in the SAS, and what did you do during your time there with the Tactical Assault Group?
it's an excellent question, one a lot of people ask. At the time, the Tactical Assault Group, the counter-terrorism unit, was a defence commitment. So the Air Force provided all of the air assets, so that they'd provide all of the aircraft to fly us anywhere, anytime. So they'd have aircraft on short notice to be able to come and get us. The Navy provided divers for the waterborne troop, so that all of the oil platforms around Australia, the oil and gas platforms, shipping and things like that, if any of them ever became a target, would have that specialized skill set that the clearance divers bring to be able to assault those targets and save the lives of the hostages and sort of recover the assets. And the photographer was, because of the training that we had, was a part of that commitment. And so I was there in an intelligence role. So it was multiple roles. So I'd be involved in the training side, sort of capturing the training, what they're doing, how they're doing it, being able to give them sort of feedback on the training. When we're doing reconnaissance missions, I'd be doing all the photography and video of potential targets. So we had a database of all potential targets. So photographs of all of what were considered, well, these are potential targets that could be of interest to terrorists. So things like hotels and government buildings and gas and oil platforms and refineries. So we'd visit all of these places and build up information on them so that if anything ever happened there, the guys doing the assault would be able to provide all the information so that they wouldn't be going in blind. They'd know what type of door lock to expect, what type of hinges, what sort of windows. We'd go into that level of detail, what the walls are made of, so that if doors are being blasted off or windows are being blown out or holes put in walls, they'd know how much explosives to use. So they're not blowing the building down, they're just making an entry point. So involved in all that side, collecting all of the intelligence, and then involved, which for me was very new, was in the disseminating of all of that intelligence. I'd be collating intelligence from different agencies, and then I'd be briefing all of the squadron on here's so if we're on an exercise or on a mission, so here's who the targets are, this is who's taken the building or the aircraft or whatever the target is. Here's who's there. Here's how many terrorists we believe there are. Here's their demands. Remembering that because this is a military force, it actually has to be given permission from the government to be used within Australia. So initially, police would be on the ground, and there'd be a request made for support from the Australian Defence Force to provide assistance, which is what we see with bushfires and so forth. There's a request put out for assistance, as with the pandemic. The Defence Force can't just walk out and say, oh, we're going to come and help you. There has to be a request. And it was, and still it's the same with the counter-terrorism. There's a request for assistance. So I'd be collating all the information I could get from the different agencies, the police force and other intelligence agencies that were involved, bringing that together, putting plans together with snipers. Where do we want snipers? What sort of information can they get back to us? And then getting the snipers who are out on surveillance getting all the information that they could get. They'd be taking photographs for us, so I'd be processing those photos, so we'd have up-to-date photographs of targets, and then building on, sort of briefing, here's what we know, here's what's happening, and then in conjunction with that, the troop leaders would be building up their assault planes, so based on the intelligence we could be providing them. So as a photographer, yeah, it was got to do what was called a regimental intelligence officers course, and it was fascinating. It was really exciting and very challenging, of course physically, but also mentally, and because it's also things that I initially hadn't been trained for or expected to do, so it was all very new and thoroughly enjoyed it, and that commitment by the Defence Force and by the Navy continued on until the late 90s. And then the emphasis changed around a bit, and it became, my understanding is, a purely an Army commitment at that stage. So the methodology and the techniques and the strategies and tactics got refined enough that it was okay, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full Defence Force commitment. We can take it down and scale it down a bit and it be just as effective.
Oh, phenomenal. Is there anything that you can talk about in terms of things that you did? I mean, obviously, if it's a question that's such a loaded question, I know, and we can cut this out if you can't. That's fine.
Yeah, no, look, there's stuff that absolutely I'm comfortable talking about. I remember the first time I was exposed to the regiment, so I was invited along. My role, I actually didn't have to do the Carter course, so I didn't have to go through the selection process, unlike everyone else on the squadron. I was about the only one. There's one person in an admin role from Navy.
So they would have been giving you the middle finger for that.
Well, no, because it was fully expected that we had to do everything that the guys did. It was, okay, you didn't do the course, but you run with us. If you're here, you run with us. So had to be able to perform at their levels and do the things they did. So yeah, my initial introduction was an exercise in Victoria at an old migrant hostel centre. And it was a very, very big exercise, a lot of assets, a lot of people involved, from police through federal agencies, all sorts. And when the final assault went in, the noise that again, is that violence, that it was the first time I'd seen that speed and violence of assault, and buildings being blown apart almost is what it felt like. It was, but there's much more strategic, like specific doors and windows coming off buildings and guys piling in. It was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And then so the next day it's like, okay, you're coming off with us to the airfield. And they said, so we have this thing called fast roping. And I'm sort of listening to it thinking, oh, yeah, okay, this is bullshit. Who's actually going to just jump out of a helicopter without being clipped in or hanging onto anything, just slide down a rope? And so we get up in the air and he throws the rope out and he says, okay, so watch this guy. He's going to show you how to do it. He leans out, grabs the rope, and down he goes. Like, what the fuck? What did I just see? No. And so it was like a pair of flying gloves, some leather gloves. And at that stage, a lot of the vision you see now, guys put their boots on the rope. And that was an absolute no-no at the time, because as you slid down, the rubber off your boots would burn onto the rope and make the rope really slippery.
Yeah.
So it was, okay, now it's your turn. Out you go. And so lean out, grab on, slide down. None of this, okay, we'll start from 10 feet, 50 feet, 100, like work our way up. It's, no, you're in a helicopter, Iroquois helicopter, and you're up at whatever the height of the rope was. Out you go. And there's guys falling out after you. It's like, whoa! I think, so in a sense, it was like that whole scenario in the helicopter and being exposed to what was happening was their way of just doing a pre-selection without it being a selection course. Is this stuff freaking you out, or are you okay with it? When I got to the regiment, I had to go and do the para course. So I had to do the jumping out of a parachute, jumping out of a perfectly serviceable aircraft and doing all the parachuting, which that's not just limited to the Special Air Service. So there's 3 RAR. I think it's 3 RAR is the Army's parachute regiment. So I was on course with a Commodore, and then all these grunts had done their basic training and were doing the para course. And oh my God, the number of people that got injured on that course was incredible.
Really?
There is just this attrition rate that's just people who didn't listen, who didn't understand, who didn't learn how to land properly. And this is the difference between getting thrown out of a helicopter onto the rope and the parachute course. It was, you're hanging in these harnesses, practicing and practicing, doing all these drills, which there was none of that jumping out of the helicopter. It's just go, sink or swim. Whereas the jumping out of the aircraft was much more documented. It was a proper course. So did the parachuting course, the regimental intelligence officers course, which is all for Navy is very different. Not a lot of people within the Navy got to do those things aside from the divers. But interestingly, the guy that was my parachuting instructor, he was trying to get into the regiment. We hit it off quite well, Shane and I. And he finally got through the selection course on his 3rd try, which you think, oh my God, it took you 3 tries. It's a very, very hard course, and not unusual for people not necessarily to make it on their first attempt.
Well, it's something like an 85 to 90% like attrition was a dropout rate. It's huge.
Yeah, it is enormous. And the number of people that just don't understand how intense it is. It's like, there's nothing new here. That it's out there that this is a hard course, and you're told about it and told how to train. And so Shane was he did all his initial regiment training and came into the counter-terrorism squadron. And on one of the assaults, no, it was on a training night. They're in a high-rise building, and I think it was like the 7th or 8th floor, and doing essentially a fast rope down a lift well, down a lift shaft. So not climbing down it or anything like that, doing this thing of reaching out as you would on a helicopter and sliding down the ropes and twisting your hands to slide on the cables, which is an amazing way of going down, and total pitch blackness. And he's reached out, and this guy's got thousands of jumps behind him. He was a parachute instructor. He's just thousands of jumps. He's reached out in the dark, NVGs, fully kitted up with his weapons and all his body armor, and missed.
Oh, no.
And not quite got hold of the cable. So one hand sort of got, he's scrambling with his other hand, and he's realized as he's going down that it's not going to happen. He's been able to sort of control it slightly with the cable, and all his parachute training meant he's been able to fall this 7 or 8 stories, hit the bottom and roll and wash off a lot of the speed. Now, he broke both legs, but he didn't kill himself. Oh my God, how does a guy do that and not kill himself? And
that's
just
crazy.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And so lots of extremes of sort of people pushing themselves and sort of pulling out at the other end. And then fun things like being out on one of the gas platforms well off the West Australian coast. And there's this, we're sort of looking over the gas platform. There's in the water, there's this great big plume of something coming up, be it bubbles or water, and we couldn't work it out. And the guys on the platform couldn't tell us what it was. And so you look down into the water and it's just sharks. It is full of sharks beneath the platform. And the guys were saying when they first got out there, they used to feed the sharks. They used to throw stuff down, and the sharks would just snap at anything that hit the water. And someone suddenly realized, you know, if we keep doing that, one of us falls in, we're fucked. absolutely screwed. And so they stopped. There's no feeding the sharks anymore. Because they said, like, you throw a simple little thing like a potato in and the sharks would go for it. And so they've gone, well, we've got to do an assault on here. We've got to swim in on here. Do we or don't we use shark cages? How do we do it? So, well, no, we don't. We just have to work with it. And that's the environment we're going to go in. And then this big plume, they've said, well, we don't know what it is. Is it going to be safe for us to, if we have to jump off, if we jump in that direction, what's going to happen if we hit it? So, well, let's find out. So not from down low, we're up high in the gas platform, because if we're going to jump, that's where it's going to be from. Jump. and so threw life jacket on just in case, well, if it's just bubbles and we sink. So it's like, well, what if it's just air bubbles and there's nothing to actually support us and we just go down and sink? We're going to need something to bring us back to the surface. And then conversely, what if it's solid water and we hit this jet of water? Are we going to break things? And as it turned out, it was a big jump, especially wearing a life jacket to support yourself. It turned out it was very innocuous. It was just, okay, yeah, you hit it and you just like hitting the water normally. But just the guts to jump from that height to the water, down to the water, and just think, oh, well, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We'll do it. It's just, and not unusual, just not unusual. Absolutely. An amazing group of people, no doubt about that.
Absolutely. So moving on from your time in the military, since 99, basically when I was starting primary school, you've worked as both photographer, video editor, and a videographer, and we've touched on that a little bit. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you and bring you on, not only because of your experience in the military, because I think that brings a unique insight, but also your editing and your keen eye for visual things. I wanted to talk to you about things in the film industry, specifically with the angle of action films, spy films, because that's primarily what I talk about on here. Normally I look at things like the marketing and all that sort of stuff, but I wanted to talk to you about sort of realism in action films with your unique perspective on that. And then secondly, touch on filmmaking techniques and sort of how they've changed over the years and how that has benefited or conversely not benefited realism and authenticity in action films. So let's start with Bond, because I'm a Bond nerd. It's my passion. And let's
ex-Navy.
He's ex-Navy. He's special forces. He's a spy. Like, there's the case to be made that if you had gone that intelligence route, you were basically the Australian Bond.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, Bond is a commander, and I was a non-commissioned. I got out as a petty officer, and very different. That's not to say I don't appreciate being cast in the same role as you. I mean, oh my God, that's
well, you've got the jet black hair.
I may have had hair once, but not anymore, unfortunately.
But look, in terms of Bond himself, he's a one-man army. He often faces hordes of goons all on his own, gets blown up, and usually wins the day. Obviously, in the latest film, you've seen that, right? I'm not going to spoil absolutely. It. Yeah, you've seen it, so I'm not going to spoil it by saying that he dies. But usually he wins, right?
What about everyone else? Oh my God!
I think if people are listening to this, they've seen the film already. But
if you haven't seen it, go and see it. It is fantastic. Despite the spoiler alert, it is a really good film. I think one of the things that is a consistent throughout the action film genre and the spy film is the need for a strong story. You've got to have a decent story. We've seen a number of action films, especially Expendables 2, Expendables 3. Like, you've got, it's about the action rather than about the story, and we have seen a lot of that in a number of Hollywood films. And so
since the 80s, roughly, like that's where the big macho men, your Arnie's, your Stallones, your Dolph Lundgrens, all those sort of guys. Yes. That's where the Expendables films are direct, like they're riffing on the 1980s Macho Man movies, right?
Absolutely. They're all, as you were saying, about The Rock. They're all gym junkie big guys. There's not many of them that are very lean and could just keep going. They'll pick up the great big machine gun and be able to hand hold it. It was like, hello.
That's a thing that we have on a tripod usually.
Yeah, especially for accuracy. You want accuracy? You're not going to hand hold it.
Volume of fire. What are you talking about?
Oh my God.
But in terms of, say, like
volume of, if you want to know about volume of fire, have a read about the difference between the American forces and how much ammunition they used per person in the Vietnam War versus the Australians, and the amount of fire that they put down compared to the Australians, and the effectiveness of that fire. Putting thousands of rounds down range doesn't necessarily achieve
that's the whole American military ethos, basically, and that's followed all the way. Well, it is. It is. It's followed all the way through to Afghanistan. Their whole ethos is put rounds down range, and that's why they have squad-mounted machine guns, is because their whole thing is we're going to put down as many rounds down range to overwhelm the enemy. Whereas the Aussies, as you said, it's more they're more trained to a degree. They're more sort of specialized because they have to be, because they don't have the breadth of the American military
the numbers
as well. Yeah. But thinking of Bond itself, going back to he's a one-man army.
I love Bond.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you got me into Bond, right? You're the irresponsible parent that let a primary school kid watch GoldenEye, watch The Living Day. I think it was The Living Daylights was my first one that I watched on VHS, and I always loved.
That was your first.
No, Daylights is amazing. What are you talking about? It's such an underrated film. The first Bond film I ever saw in cinemas was with you. We were going to see Harry Potter at. This is talking to our age, I guess, as I grew up during the transition of film to digital, and we went to go and see a Harry Potter film when I was a very young kid, and the film reel burnt, and we got free tickets to go back, but we couldn't go and see Harry Potter because they'd burnt the film reel and they didn't have a replacement. So I begged and pleaded for you to take me to see Die Another Day, and for all its faults, that film was my first Bond film in cinemas. And then a few years later, when Daniel Craig came on, you and I were in Sydney, and we went and saw it. I think it was opening night in a packed theatre in Sydney. I remember it was just crowded, and we had to leave through a fire escape because it was just packed. So I mean, you've really been a part of me growing up through Bond. I wanted to talk to you, I guess, about your time in the military and relating to Bond, I guess, like usually, and especially even with the latest film, like you go back to the old ones, it was always him and maybe one other person, and they would go into the villain's lair and attack the villain's lair. Then some of the Roger Moore ones, he'd go in with an army and it'd be a whole army and Bond attacking it. But we've gone back to that sort of one-man army, like in No Time to Die, for instance, it's him and the other girl. That doesn't happen in real life, does it? Like you're attacking a villain who's got a biological weapon, essentially. He's going to destroy the world. Are you really going to send one person in to save the world? Like, what would really happen? What would really happen? What would the SAS do? That's why the SAS is there, right?
Well, exactly. You have elite forces like that to be able to deal with those sorts of situations. So a one man going into an extreme situation like that is probably very, very unlikely. I'm not going to say it doesn't or hasn't happened, because that side of it, really, none of us should ever know about.
That's
anything
fantasy
that happens there. It's. I mean, that's secret. There's spooks. It's spy shit. So a lot of it is made up. A lot of it is. It's about selling films. It's about having a story that's exciting. I think we all like to think that character could be real.
Yeah.
Which is why he's so likable. We want that character to be real. We want that character to be there, because it's easier to relate to a single character than it is to a squadron of troops.
Yeah.
doing an assault. We can relate to that one person more so than that. And it's that damaged character, that damaged person that we see in so many films, from Die Hard being the damaged character through to Bond. And Bond is damaged. That is a part of his character, is that he is damaged. He can't win in love. He's not able to be sympathetic or emotional. He has to be that cold, hard, calculated killer. So there is an element of damage to that character. And so we all like to try and see a bit of ourselves there, because I'm a bit damaged. I could do that. That's me. We're fighting that fight, and we always want to encourage the underdog, because we want the underdog to win. But if he doesn't, well, we didn't invest that much in him. But I mean, he's on the right. He's on the right side. He should win.
And it's that thing of, especially was it post 9/11 as well. We saw a rise of the superheroes and to an extent the spies as well, because we want to feel like we've got that person fighting on our side. The Americans and the Brits and the Australians, when they went to Iraq and Afghanistan, it was a questionable war in terms of why they were there. But we needed to feel like we were safe and we were being protected by the big bad terrorists who blew up buses and buildings and all of that stuff. And one way of doing that is having the hero who'll sweep in and save the day, and feeling like we've got that guy there. Have you seen the film? It's on Netflix, SAS. Is it Red Notice? I think it's known overseas, or SAS. It's the Rise of the Black Swan.
The Rise of the Black Swan. It's known as both. It's actually.
I think they called it Black Swan because there was the Red Notice film with Ryan Reynolds and The Rock coming out later, so they changed the title. But it's based on the novel Red Notice by Andy McNab, who, like yourself, is he's ex-British SAS.
That book, his books are fantastic, aren't they?
And that book's fantastic. I loved that book. And I mean, the Tom Buckingham series, they have been a bit more outlandish and a bit more diehard compared to some of his other characters. But that film really
the demand of his audience as well, though.
Oh, absolutely. It's like your Matthew Rileys, right? You have the hero.
It's going to sell.
Yeah, of course. But that film, to me, for a film titled SAS, that really missed the mark. It almost made the guys in the regiment look like idiots.
Agreed. Agreed. As I alluded, well, not alluded to, as I said earlier, the guys at the regiment are anything but. They are all incredibly switched on. That is one of the selection criteria, is that these guys are smart. It's not just physical. They've got to be able to operate in as a 3 or 4 man unit behind enemy lines, and be able to replace anyone that gets hurt or injured or killed. They've got to be able to pick up and do the other role that the person who's died has taken with them. So they're all very smart. And you're quite right. It didn't just downplay it. It was almost insulting to regiment guys. I think it was very much this upper class guy who was, well, I'm going to do it all on my own. It's like, well, that's not how the regiment works. It is very much a team effort. It's from snipers right the way through to the guys kicking in the doors. It's a real team effort. Everything is synchronized. Everything is working together. And again, it comes back to that training. These guys are training together really incredibly tightly, so that snipers can be putting bullets down range, and the guys, the assaulters, know that they're safe, that they're not going to cop a stray bullet.
They're not going to have someone standing on the roof of the train shooting them all down, and like just dumb stuff like that. It just seemed like they went in without a plan. They're just rushing in.
That's not going to happen.
No.
And the reason it's not going to happen, you may land on the ground there and go, oh my God, we've got to go in now, which, okay, that can happen. And the fact that they train together day in, day out, nighttime, daytime, raining, in all conditions. They're training on aircraft, they're training on buses, they're training in trucks, on gas platforms. They've trained in every scenario so that they can turn up and they can go, we've done this before hundreds of times together. We know what to do. We may not have done specifically this location, but we know what to do. And as a team, they do it together.
Well, and the Brits train in the Channel Tunnel. They do exercises in the Channel Tunnel. It's not like they don't know what's going on in there. Yeah.
All of those forces are continually identifying and reassessing potential targets. What are potential locations where we're going to have issues, and where do we need to train so that when something happens, we've been there and done it.
Exactly. Well, moving on from non-realistic or bad movies, Bond's not bad. I mean, it's had its bad stuff.
No.
But we're moving on from non-realistic and non-authentic. Let's talk about some content that I guess portrays a more realistic and authentic view of the military. And one thing that you and I often speak about is the HBO series Generation Kill, which follows the US Marines during the, I believe it was the first Iraq War.
Yes.
Why does that series work so well, and why does that feel like such an authentic representation of life in the military?
I think it's not trying to say that one person has won the war. This is looking at through the eyes of a journalist. So it's fictional, but it's through the eyes of a Rolling Stone journalist, looking at just how the guys in this one particular unit work together, how they operate, how they feel. And it's gritty and it's real. I think most veterans who see that would say, yeah, I can empathize with what they're going through. I've been through some of that, or I know those sorts of characters. In a lot of cases in the films, we have to see extremes in character to actually identify who each character is. And in a film, you've got to develop that character incredibly quickly. I think one of the nice things about streaming, and certainly Generation Kill is a part of that, is in a series, we can develop those characters over time. So those characters don't have to be of the extreme. Their emotions can be a little more subtle. And so when something happens that is emotional, I think it hits us a bit more than when it's that extreme of character. So the Generation Kill series, I think, really portrays that incredibly well. I think what they're going through, the day-to-day grind, it's not just continuous bang, bang, bang. It's sitting, it's waiting, it's being bored, it's having to shit on the side of the road, it's having to burn off all of the sewage in the oil drums. It's just all this stuff that just helps build up to the climaxes, so that when they happen, it's like, oh my God. Which so much of a good film or a good series should be, is that slow increase in tension. It's gradual increase and then bang, and then release. So there's that tension and release. And I think it really did that tension and release very well and built its characters really well. So even the dumb hick from out country who really didn't have a clue about life in general, you started to really get a bit of a feeling almost sorry for him, as just how little he actually knew when he was going into all of this.
And you almost empathize with the incompetent leader as well. Everyone's having to follow the incompetent leader. I think they call him Captain America. You almost empathize. He's
following
with that,
his
right?
agenda, isn't he? He has his own agenda to follow, and that is making sure that he looks good to the hierarchy so that he can get promoted down the track.
And he doesn't have to sit on a convoy in the middle of the desert anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that contrasted, talking about series, ironically, based off a novel by Chris Ryan, there's the Strike Back series.
Yes.
which it started out as a much more story-driven. You had it was based on the book, right? But then it got into, from, what was it, season 2 onwards, it was just bang, bang, shoot, shoot, kill them. And it wasn't very realistic at all. It was fun, and it was sexy, and it was cool.
Absolutely.
And I thoroughly enjoy it. But and
Yes.
the tactics they use, okay, it might be quite, in terms of how they hold the guns and everything, it might be realistic, but it's not a realistic series at all.
Yeah.
I think that's why Generation Kill is so much more powerful and so much more memorable and has that staying power, because, as you said, it has those boring elements. It has the mundanity of what being in the military is like, because it isn't always bang, 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 because you'd burn out very quickly in war.
Well, certainly for your average brunt,
of course,
it's a lot of boredom. When I first got to the regiment, I've just gone, oh my God, if this is what the army's like, where do I sign? How did I miss out on this? And it's like, no, this is not the army.
Yeah.
This is not the army. Don't get any illusions. And so the elite forces is very different. And yes, they too have their downtime, not so much their downtime, their boring time. They're sitting in a hide, waiting, doing nothing. They're just waiting for an aircraft. You're just sitting and waiting and waiting, waiting for an extraction, or you're waiting for the go. It's like, we're ready. When can we go? When can we go?
How many hours in a plane are you waiting before the jump?
Oh, yeah. How sick do you get as you're doing the tactical flying down low in the tropics, and it's hot and the aircraft's hot inside, and one person throws up and it's a chain reaction because the aircraft is bouncing from one side to the other.
It's not a commercial airliner with a pressurized cabin and air conditioning.
And it stinks. You are so glad to get out of there.
What, you don't get the mid-flight bickies and the refreshing beverages on a trolley?
We would not occasionally. It wasn't all the time. We would spend most of our time in Hercules aircraft, but we would also occasionally have all the gear go in the Hercules and take essentially the essential weapons, and we'd fly in one of the RAAF commercial airliner equivalent, which they'd usually fly the politicians or the VIPs around in. And that was luxury. That was getting served proper food. Everyone loved flying in those aircraft.
Beer nuts and martinis. Another film that I think really works well and tells that true story is the Zero Dark 30, the Catherine Bigelow film, which is about the SEAL team. Well, it's more about the spies who lead the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and then you have the SEALs who raid the compound, and that very famous raid where the helicopter crashed and everything. That, again, it feels very grounded and realistic. And to me, at least, as someone who's never been in the military or has never been in spycraft, I've always I wanted to be in the military, but unfortunately, due to my spinal injury, it's something that I wasn't allowed to do because they wouldn't let me in. As an outsider, at least, that film for me really feels like it's a bit more of a realistic take on what actual spy work is like and what actually looking for the target is. It's not, we're going to fly to here and fly to here like James Bond does, and we're going to go to a bar and there's going to be a contact. Realistically, it's long, hard hours sitting in front of a computer, as you did, well, back in the day, at least, not necessarily in front of the computers, but looking at video footage, looking at, photographs of compounds, and, interrogating what the spies in the film do. They interrogate people, and there's a lot of downtime in that. Can you speak to that film a little bit and sort of how you feel about that?
I think what it does well is shows not just the assault.
Yeah.
It talks to the whole idea that there is an intelligence story beforehand. There's a lot of work that goes. I think perhaps a little bit too much focus on a single character, but that's a part of developing a film. You've got to have someone that you can relate to in the film.
Yeah,
and
of
who you
course.
can focus your attention on. And so that whole idea of the intelligence analysis, building up the picture, interrogating intelligence assets from around the world, how it all comes together so that then an assault can happen. And I think something like Bond doesn't necessarily show that side. It's all gadgets and it's all, here it is. And as you said, you turn up and there's your contact. Whereas the reality of it is it's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of imagery analysis. There's a lot of drones flying. There's a lot of listening to radio frequencies, a lot of listening to telephones to try and determine where people are, and then looking at bank accounts. So there's all this stuff that I thought that really sort of brought it together, that they were able to work out, okay, well, where are these people?
Absolutely.
Where are we going to find him? And then the political ramifications of, yeah, we're going to do it. And the side of the politicians taking a lot of the glory. Like, yes, we've done it. Wow. How
We've got the photographer in the room with, was it Obama at the time? I think it was. You know, they're all cheering. We got him, and it's a little bit. You go, you didn't get him. You just. Sure. I think it was Obama.
Because it was we as the team. Which I mean that's true, and the military are there to be used by the politicians, and that's another story in itself. The fact that the way they're used, and I think we touched on it a bit with the Special Air Service being used for PR roles in some cases. But yeah, I think Zero Dark 30 showed that well. It's a story that people knew. So there was an element of, well, this is real.
It's a true story.
It's a true story. There were elements added to it that made it a better story.
Oh, of course. You have to. It's Hollywood, right?
You have to. You have to, because you've got 120 minutes in which to tell the story.
Would you want to see James? Yeah. Would you want to see James Bond take on a bit more of a realistic approach, like what Zero Dark 30 did, rather than it being you go to your contact, you get your exposition dump of, I know this is what's going to happen. It's going to lead to this person. It's all very linear. Would you want to see Bond in that world where it's a bit more grounded and a bit more of, it's not the gritty punch 'em up Daniel Craig stuff, but it's actual spy work? Would that work?
Well, look, it could. I think we're actually starting to see a little bit more of that introduced into it. Even though, like, the realism of the fights, the grittiness of the fights, we never saw that in earlier Bond films. Having that introduced shows that, you know, if you get punched, it hurts. I mean, the fact they get punched and punched and punched and punched and punched and punched.
Or in No Time to Die, how many explosions does he survive? There's the bomb at the grave. There's it's 4 hand grenades in the stairwell fight when they do the one.
I have severe tinnitus in my ears and hearing damage from being exposed to explosions and stuff going off. It's like that close to it, you actually, your internal organs are going to take a hammering, not just your ears. Your internal organs, when you're that close, are going to be impacted. So to be hit so many times, so quickly by so many explosions, oh my gosh, you won't be gelling inside, but you'll be close to it. You'll be certainly having problems going to the loo.
Oh, definitely.
The whole realism with Bond, I think adding a little bit more to the sort of the backstory, just being able to bring out some of the characters, and this is how the intelligence was developed. But is that what people want in those films?
Yeah, and that's a fine line that you've got to tread, right? Is because everyone always talks about, we've got to go back to Fleming, and what was Fleming? He was a spy. He was a naval officer in the war, and he created Bond as a fictional version of himself, basically as an escape. So, do we want to see that ride that he was trying to escape from? Maybe not. And people obviously have had very strong reactions to not only No Time to Die with, you know, the death of Bond and all that sort of stuff, but in terms of Daniel Craig's whole arc. it's been very, I'm going to say it's been very polarizing. You either love it or you hate it. There's no real middle ground, unlike, say, a Pierce Brosnan or a Roger Moore, where it was purely fun or there was some moments of severity and seriousness.
On Bond and the early stuff, as you were saying, Ian Fleming, what he was writing, if you picture the time that Ian Fleming was alive and working in the Navy and in intelligence, was World War II.
Yeah.
So the things like sonar and radar, the things that we take for granted now, were very new, very early, very new developments. Aircraft technology, I mean, unmanned drones? No. So the ability to get intelligence, you had people listening to the radios, but you had to have people on the ground to get intelligence. You had to have people building up relationships and getting intelligence. And that remained the case. And by the way, it still does. But the means that are now available for getting intelligence are so much greater, from unmanned drones through to the banks of computers that are listening to telephone calls or radio conversations and
or Facebook or whatever, right?
Yeah, they're able to get intelligence from so many sources. And so it's a very different way of bringing together an operation and being able to present to an operator or to a tactical assault group, here's the intelligence. It's no longer, well, we had spy out in the field. It's come from all these different locations. So
yeah,
it's Bond as he originally was. He has to be different.
So obviously what I do for a living is marketing and advertising, and that's sort of what this podcast is all about, is sort of the selling aspect. When you get movies marketing themselves as realistic war movies, let's look at something like Act of Valor, where they used realism as a massive selling point. They had real Navy SEALs instead of actors. They had live fire on set, so they had the Swick boats come in with the miniguns firing real bullets, and they used real as I guess it was a selling point. The film was basically, it was a recruiting tool for the Call of Duty generation, right? It was similar to what Top Gun was in the 80s. Like Top Gun. Oh my God. Top Gun really, it brought in a new generation that wanted to be Navy pilots and Air Force pilots. I guess that's what Act of Valor was trying to do, was get more, kids to come in and, want to be soldiers. But does that marketing work? Because that film, I don't think it was particularly successful, A, from a financial point of view, B, from a story point of view. I know quite a few of the SEALs who were involved with it have since come out and said they didn't actually want to be involved with it. They were basically told, we have to be involved with it because, as we've discussed already, they're being used as PR tools rather than as what they're supposed to be doing. So does this marketing work, or should Hollywood stick to what Hollywood does well, make big action films with actors and not rely on these marketing gimmicks? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, look, military are good at being military. They are not good at being actors. You've got to stick with your strengths. You can't expect someone who's a special forces operator to be able to act. And that, I think, was one of the downfalls of that show, was the quality of acting. It was, you could tell they were trying to deliver lines. There was no real depth to their character, that they didn't feel that depth. It was, so, okay, we've used real, and that these people are real in their role. This is what they do, but they couldn't convey that because putting together a film is such a structured process. I love looking at the making of different shows. And I remember watching the making of, Toy Story. And the making of Toy Story, because it's an animation, it has to be mapped out so carefully. And the wall, there was one shot showing the wall that had every single shot in the film on a card. so that you could see. They knew exactly what they were doing, how they were doing it, what the camera angles would be. And a film is no different. You have to be able to do that. Now, I think Act of Valor, you couldn't have done that film pre-digital when it was all film, because, and that was one of the things, they were putting cameras in places that you couldn't put cameras before. They were
on the
blowing
guns,
cameras
on the
up.
helmets. Yeah.
Yeah. And they were using those techniques, those gimmicks. It was almost a bit gimmicky in some ways, as a way of trying to video game it, make it into a bit of a video game, as you said. It's that Call of Duty thing. But yeah, the whole thing of using Navy SEALs instead of actors, I don't think it worked. You've got to have a really strong story, and you've got to execute that well. And that requires professionals to execute it. You've got to have professional people producing it, who can bring the money in, who can bring the correct actors in. The team, they're putting together a professional team, and the better the team, the better the finished product.
And that's where something like Top Gun worked so well, because you had the funding from the military and from the Navy. You had all the assets, and both Act of Valor and Top Gun are telling a fictional story. It's not like they're telling a real story of anything that's happened. But what made Top Gun work so well was you had fucking Tom Cruise in the lead. You had the most charismatic actor in Hollywood, for all his faults. He's a bloody good actor, and he's a leading man, and he carried that film all the way through. And that's where Top Gun really succeeded and did so well, is because you had the best of the best actors.
It's about being able to have empathy with the character, about being able to have a believable character. And if you've got an actor, if you've got a Navy SEAL trying to give you a believable character, he can give him a believable version of himself, but not that character. So you need someone who can do that, who is knowledgeable in the ways of bringing a character to life and delivering lines.
Very people are advisors.
Giving those subtle inflections in the way things are delivered, but who can also listen to a director and understand that direction.
And that's why acting is it's an underrated skill. People go, I could be an actor, I could go and do this. You know, you get all these musicians who are going in and being actors now. But it's a really, really strong skill that not a lot of people quite grasp how difficult it is to do. And you look at, even in Act of Valor, so you had like the home scenes where, you know, the SEALs go home to the family, and the wife and the Christian family are all there. And
oh my God,
you compare that to Top Gun, and there's one scene where they're all in a bar. He's trying to hit on the girl, and they start singing "You've Lost That Loving Feeling," and that it's an iconic scene, but it works so well.
Yes,
it's both showing the home life for military personnel, but Top Gun did it really well.
It did it very well. The reality is that like the pilots are elite. There's the number of people that want to be pilots is enormous, and they're able to whittle it down to the best of the best. And they work hard and they play hard. And that was a way of showing that they play hard. And I think that whole idea of the home scene, that look, a lot of the guys involved in SEALs and at the regiment are senior. They've been in it for a while, and they do have families, and that is reality. But that doesn't stop them. They work hard. They also have to play hard. They've got to let off that steam. They can't go back to the family completely stressed out from what they've just been doing. They've got to have that chance to de-stress, be it sort of physically or having beers with the guys and talking it through and debriefing on what's happened. So they can do that well, but they can't do the acting well, as you said.
Yeah.
It's a very different thing. And being able to bring it all together, I think you look at the war films and the spy films, which were shot in a film age.
So when we're saying a film age, so the actual physical medium of film, right? Because
the cameras rather than the digital format.
Yeah, because it's evolved, right? It's evolved a lot
dramatically. The cost of film was extreme. You couldn't run multiple cameras at the one time.
Well, it's even more extreme right now because only so many houses make the film. And that's something that I wanted to touch on with you as an editor and as a filmmaker as well. Has the transition from shooting on film to digital made a difference? You spoke about when we sort of when we began speaking in this podcast, we were talking about, how it went from editing on tape decks, where it was, huge amounts of data, and now it's all on a computer. Compare something like, say, Skyfall, which was shot by Roger Deakins on the Arri Alexa digital cameras, to Robert Rodriguez, or something like Active Valor, which was shot by Shane Hurlbert, where they shoot a lot of coverage with these digital cameras, and they just shoot and shoot and shoot. And then you compare that to, say, a filmmaker like Chris Nolan, who exclusively shoots on film and shoots a lot of IMAX too. Has that transition from film to digital made filmmakers lazy in the way they tell stories? And do we not rely on, the visual storytelling aspect as more because we do have the abundance of footage that we can shoot now?
I think what we see and we get a feel for very quickly when we go to the cinema or we watch a film or a series is whether the story's any good. And that's always the first place, that the writer has to get the story right and the screenplay's got to be good. The interpretation of that screenplay into how is this going to look and how is it going to be filmed is something that it's always the case. The more planning you do, the better the end result. So if you can plan everything out, think of 1917, the planning that went into that film to give it that feel that it was all one take from start to finish, that it just moved through seamlessly. That took an enormous amount of planning, and the end result is amazing. Now, if you do that amount of planning, it's going to work. And it's then not, do you have hundreds of cameras? Whether you have or haven't doesn't matter. It matters the story and the planning. You can't, just by having a lot of really good cameras, tell a really good story. One, you've got to have a good story, but you also have to technically know how to film it and how to capture it so that it means something. Just by pointing a camera at each person doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to do it in one take. You still may have to have each of your characters deliver their lines separately. So having multiple cameras can be a waste. I mean, having a B unit be able to do all your pickup is great, but having lots and lots of cameras for an action scene, you're still better off to plan it out and know exactly how it's going to work and not just, spray and hope, spray and pray. You've got to actually know, well, this is going to happen, so we need the cameras to get this. It's shooting explosions is incredibly difficult because so often they are so much bigger than what you expect. The camera is framed on, 3 or 4 times the height of the characters, and the explosion goes 100 feet in the air and the cameras don't get any of it.
Well, there's that famous photo that you took when you were at the regiment where everyone's sitting on the roofs of the Range Rovers and the vans, and you were sitting on top of, was it one of the Ford Transit vans or something?
So they were F100, Ford
That's
F100s.
Right,
yeah. At that time, we were using F100s and, what were they? They were Ford vans, transit vans.
Yeah, transit vans, yeah.
And so each year we'd have a squadron photograph, and a couple of us came up with the idea. They sort of said, thinking of doing this, was sort of built and fleshed out the idea of just, instead of being a squadron photo, we'd do it with everyone just sitting down. We'd actually do it at the Method of Entry House, and we'd have this massive big fuel air explosion going off behind. So I've got these massive flames going like 30, 40 meters plus into the air, taking up the whole space. Plus we had colored smoke going off around the place. And we did all this planning. I got a couple of the Army photographers to set up a couple of cameras. Like, okay, this is what's going to happen. We've trialed it. I'm going to be down there. I'm going to run in, be on the shot, and we'll give you the thumbs up when we're ready. So I've gone in. We've got guys all over the MOE house. and they've done a countdown, and one of the guys has hit the clapper for everything to go off. He's triggered the explosions, and stuff's gone everywhere because we've now got smoke that's happening. There's some coloured smoke. The pressure wave from the explosion has pushed all this smoke over, 20 or 30 of the guys who suddenly, their silhouettes, their shapes, they absolutely loved the fact they were. They would have preferred to be seen, but it's like, that's part of it. But it's that planning and how quickly, just because you've got lots of cameras doesn't mean you're going to get the shot. Stuff happens. And so you've got to plan it and practice it and know exactly what's going to happen. Having the move to digital is a good thing. It means that it has, to a certain extent, democratized it. I think we're seeing filmmakers at a much lower level able to produce stuff of a much higher quality than was possible in the actual celluloid film time.
I mean, we wouldn't be able to do this, right? Even think 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do something like this. The cost of the Rode microphone that I'm using, the laptop, the camera in the laptop, that's shooting at, I think it's full high def to just be able to see each other. It's incredible the way the technology's changed. And you touched on 1917, and again, like Skyfall, that was shot by Roger Deakins, directed by Sam Mendes, and they filmed that on digital. They didn't film it on film. That was, again, shot on the RELXs, I believe it was. And it's a beautiful film. And there's this whole push of, it's got to be shot on film, like all these guys like Nolan and Spielberg are saying, because I think directors have, in the early days of digital at least, when the file sizes weren't so big because they weren't shooting on 4K, 6K, 8K, whatever they're shooting on now, they were shooting a lot of coverage because, we can. And it got lazy. You had guys like Michael Bay or guys like Robert Rodriguez who were these, as you said, well, maybe not Michael Bay because he came from the film world, but guys like Robert Rodriguez who, he was a backyard shooter, made his little indie film and wasn't necessarily at that high level that all the others were, and was able to crack into the industry because of the democratization of digital. And his films, I love Robert Rodriguez. I love his movies, but they may not be at a higher quality as what something like 1917 is, because it's not as planned out as well. Talking about editing, because this is something that you do on a daily basis as well. When it comes to editing, we saw a real shift in, I'm going to say the 2000s after the release of not necessarily the Bourne Identity, because I feel the Bourne Identity, the way that film was made was still quite traditional. But especially after Bourne Supremacy, we saw action films trying to mimic that with a lot of fast cutting and jumping around. There's that famous sequence out of, is it Taken 2 or Taken 3, where he jumps over a fence and there's something ridiculous like 60 cuts just to show him running up a street and jump a fence. There was this big change from, more planned out, more, I guess, the styles of films like The Matrix or your John Woo films, which were, you saw everything in frame. Are you a fan of this fast cutting, what we would call the gritty style, or do you prefer that more wide angle style in something like the John Wick movies where you see that bit more action?
I think each has its place. Good editing should never be seen. And good editing, you should notice, you should be focused on the story and the imagery, and you shouldn't even be focused on the camera work. You shouldn't see anything but the character and their story. The rest of it should just disappear. In a good, well-crafted film, the story and the character should triumph over everything. And so editing for the sake of it is it lazy? Is it lazy? Well, in some ways, yes, it's lazy, because you're trying to make an editing like that is a special effect. You're trying to make the special effects take over from the story and to become a part of it. That said, I love the grittiness of those close, quick cut fight scenes that you see in Bourne and that you see in there's the Daniel Craig ones. I think they add a real degree of grittiness, as I was saying earlier, about how a punch feels. You're getting more impact. You go back to earlier ones, and you certainly didn't have that feel. So
judo chop.
Yeah, judo chop. Yeah, you didn't have that feel, and the editing, that as a technique, that works in that case. It has its place, but you don't want it to be about that. You want it to be there for a reason. If the camera moves, it should be for a reason. Any camera movement needs to be thought about and calculated, and any edit is the same. It needs to be thought about. Why are we doing that? If we take that out, will we lose anything?
Yeah.
Because it's not, we can put lots and lots in, but we need to take out as much out as we can to simplify it and keep it as clean and simple as possible, so that the editing doesn't get in the way of the story or the character. That story can happen and we not see that edit. What we want to see is that the editing can be used as an effect, and it's used for a reason, and that it contributes to the story. It doesn't detract from the story, that we want it to happen and we not see that there's all that quick editing. Because then we're not watching the story, we're watching the editing. It should happen that we have all that occur and we don't even notice it as the audience. All it's done is add to the story. It progresses our story and adds to the character. So that quick, gritty editing has its place, but it's got to add to the story. It's got to be there for a reason.
Yeah, because if it's overdone, it becomes nauseating because you can't tell what's going on. And you mentioned the Daniel Craig Bond films, and what I always like to compare is Casino Royale. You compare Casino Royale and the editing and the fighting in that. It feels visceral. It feels dangerous. You go to the film that came after it, Quantum of Solace, which was directed by a different director, shot by a different cinematographer, and they went for that real handheld, shake it around, quick cuts where you couldn't tell what was going on, and as a result, it took you out of the film because you weren't following the story anymore. You weren't seeing Daniel Craig get punched. You were seeing the camera whip around and the cut to a fist or something.
It comes back to that planning. Why is the camera moving?
Yeah.
We have to know on set why we're moving the camera.
Or why are we cutting to the bullfighting in the middle of a fight? Like, does that have a reason? No, we're trying to be artistic and fancy and go, oh, it's related somehow, but is it really? No.
Is it progressing the story? What is the reason for us doing it? Because at the end of the day, we want to be engaged by the story and the character. The character has to drive that story, and they've got to achieve their goal. And if the editing gets in the way, or if the camera starts moving, it's like, why did the camera just suddenly, you're thinking about the cameraman behind the camera who was moving the camera. Why did the camera just move? You suddenly, you're no longer immersed in the story. You're thinking about the production, and as a producer, you don't want that.
Yeah, I remember you and we went to a seminar by, I can't remember who the cinematographer was. He was the guy that shot the recent Riddick film with Vin Diesel, but he had shot, it was like a swords and sandals sort of castles epic. And he was talking about how he had the vision for the film to be, much more sprawling and be more like a Ridley Scott film where you could see everything was going on. And then the director that they brought on was this guy who is young and he wanted to make it feel like the Bourne movies. So he was in the fight with the DSLR camera shaking it around, and it ended up just being a mess of a film as a result.
Look, it's why are you putting the camera in there? Okay, we want to get in close and feel it. Okay, well, the camera needs to move with the person. The camera needs to move with the action. You don't want the camera going in the opposite direction to the action.
Or just
unless
being
there's
there
a
for the
reason
sake,
for it.
or being there for the sake of it, right?
Yeah, it has to be happening for a reason. And I mean, I shot a commercial yesterday where our brief was zip. There was nothing. It's like this 15-second commercial, and we're just shooting the shit out of it because why? What are we meant to be getting here? So I was like, okay. And as an editor as well as a shooter, I'm able to look at it and say, okay, you've got no idea what we're doing here, have you? You've just got no idea what we're shooting or what the story is. I can then look at it and say, well, if I move the camera this way, or if I have the camera moving, where's it going to? What comes next? Where does it progress to? If I'm hand holding and I'm looking and it's like, oh, I'm shaking a bit, is that going to add or that's going to detract? I need a tripod because why is it handheld for that shot? It's about what's in there. Whereas today, the shoot that I was on was so much more organized. It was so much better. We shot it in, literally, we did 15-second commercial in half the time. Half the amount of vision was, probably a quarter of the amount of vision was shot. The edit will take so much less time because there's a bit of planning. There's a bit of thought that's gone into it beforehand. And you're not trying to just shoot the shit out of it because, well, we don't know what we want, which is what yesterday felt
and
like.
We'll tell the story in the edit.
Well, yeah, that's what it was.
We'll fix it in post.
I'm editing it and I'm shooting and it's like, well, okay, I'm just going to have to capture a heap and try and bring a story together. Now, I've already done the edit. It was a 15-second commercial. I did the edit for it this morning. And actually, no, I tell a lie. That was for a 30-second one, which was also, oh my God, why? What are you wanting us to do? And I was able to cut together, I think because I shot it and was editing it, I was able to bring it together, knowing the vision, and put it together in a very short amount of time. It took me, I think, 90 minutes.
Oh, wow.
To cut together this 30-second piece and grade it and have it to the client.
Bloody hell.
Which,
that's impressive. I mean, that's what experience does, right? You learn your craft, and that's even for me working at an agency level, even for small clients like dealerships where we're doing it's not a highbrow production, for instance, where we're doing, it's car dealership, for instance, right? One of our clients is a car dealership. Even then, if I'm sending a videographer out and all this sort of stuff, I'm providing a storyboard. I'll be given the script. I know what the voiceover is going to be. I then go in and storyboard it because I'm the one who's going to end up editing it. And I know that if I just send a videographer out on site, I'm not going to get what I want. So it needs to be planned, and you need to be able to tell that story and give your creatives your vision, because otherwise they're going to be lost when they get on set.
You'll turn up and you'll go, as I did, what am I meant to be shooting? Why am I here? What's the story? What are you trying to sell? It's like, if you've got some idea, if you've got someone doing exactly what you're doing, putting some thought into it beforehand, what are we trying to achieve? And how do we get people to take action at the end of it? So in a commercial, very different to a film, so in the sense that you're wanting people to take action after seeing it. It might be as simple as brand recognition. We want you to recognize the brand. We want you to Coca-Cola, Ford, whatever the brand is, that it's in your face and you recognize it. Or it could be, I want you to buy this toothpaste.
So come to our dealership at the end.
Come to our dealership.
There's a call to action at the end of it, at the end of the day.
And that's where like a feature film, something small requires an enormous amount of planning. The more planning you put into it, you should be putting a lot of planning into a commercial, so that on the day when you're shooting, when you've got crew there and you've got talent there, it's just bang, 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 bang. And you'll get potentially from your director of photography, you might get that input on, well, this could work and we could add this to it. And especially if they're an editor as well, or they have a good relationship, they've been shooting for a long time in a relationship with an editor, they'll have an understanding what the editor will need. Oh, you haven't suggested a close-up of the hand moving across something. Yeah. That would be a great way to segue from this shot to that shot. Let's capture some of those close-ups, which will, and it's in the close-ups quite often that your story is sold.
Oh, big time, big time. Well, look, I think that just about covers everything. We've been talking for quite a while now. A massive thank you for coming on, and it's been a huge pleasure talking with you. And I mean, it's been 27 years of my life, and I hadn't quite got a grasp on what you had done. And there is a lot more to your story than just I was in the military, I was in the SAS. Like it's a big story. So I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk with me and delve deeper into that. Just want to say thank you again for coming on, Tony. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I take it as such a compliment that you wanted to interview me. It's like, oh my gosh, really?
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Thank you very much for having me. And anyone that wants to find out anything more about the sort of areas I've been talking about, do a Google. And if you're interested in that whole military side of it, easy enough to find someone to talk to. Feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with someone who's still serving who you may want to chat with. Absolutely, because it's I had an amazing time doing all of that. As I said, I got to do stuff that I thought only happened in the movies, and no, that was real.
Which is so cool. So yeah, thank you very much for coming on again. I hope to have you on another episode soon. So there you go. That was my conversation with my dad, Tony Gay. Once again, I just want to say a massive thank you to Tony for coming on and talking to me, and I hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation. In the show notes for this episode, you'll be able to see the link to Tony's Instagram page, as well as a link to Wandering Warriors, who are a charity that supports SAS veterans that Tony supports and is involved with. If you enjoyed this episode, I would highly encourage you to donate to Wandering Warriors, as they do incredible work in supporting our veterans. Thanks again for listening to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay, and I'll see you in the next episode.